Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The air in my parents' kitchen was thick with tension, the kind that settled into your skin, the kind that made it impossible to breathe without feeling like you were suffocating under the weight of something unspoken. My mother sat across from me, her hands clasped together in a way that might have looked desperate if I didn't already know better, while my father shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearing his throat every few minutes as if trying to find the right words, but coming up empty. The house smelled like old coffee and dust, like a place where conversations like this had happened too many times before, like a place where guilt was used as currency and love was something that only existed when it was convenient. I leaned back slightly, arms crossed over my chest, my stomach twisting into knots as I waited for them to get to the point, already knowing that whatever was about to come out of their mouths was going to be something I wouldn't want to hear. "Jessie," my mother finally said, her voice softer than usual, almost gentle, like she was trying to ease me into something that would inevitably hurt. "We need your help, sweetheart. We wouldn't be asking if we had another choice, but things have gotten really bad, and we're afraid we might lose the house." She let the words hang in the air for a moment, giving me time to react, giving me time to process, giving me time to do exactly what she wanted me to do, feel guilty. I didn't say anything at first, didn't let my expression change, didn't let them see the way my heart clenched at the thought of them struggling, at the idea that the home I had grown up in, the home that had once felt safe before I understood how conditional love could be, was on the verge of being taken away. But even as sympathy started to creep into my chest, there was something else there, something sharp and bitter, something that had been growing for years beneath the surface doubt. I had seen this pattern before, had watched them throw money away on things that didn't matter, had watched them pour every spare cent into Ryan's dreams while barely acknowledging mine, had watched them expect me to clean up the messes they had made without ever once considering how it affected me. Still, despite everything, despite the years of neglect and the way they had always put my brother first, I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in my gut, the overwhelming guilt that came with knowing I had the means to help and that if I didn't, I would be the villain in their story forever. So I did what I had always done. I caved. I agreed to wire them $50,000, my stomach twisting as I transferred the money, my mother's voice dripping with relief as she thanked me over and over again, her words like honey laced with something poisonous. "You're such a good daughter," she murmured, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand, her grip just tight enough to remind me that this was what was expected of me, that this was what I was supposed to do. "Ryan's so lucky to have a sister like you." The words felt strange, off, like there was something I was missing, something I should have questioned, something I should have seen coming. But I didn't. Not until 3 days later, when I was sitting in my car, scrolling through my phone absent-mindedly, only to have my breath catch in my throat at the sight of a post that made my blood run cold. Ryan stood in front of a brand new sports car, the kind that cost more than most people made in a year, the kind that shined in the sunlight like something out of a commercial, his arm draped casually over the hood as he grinned at the camera, the caption beneath the image making my stomach churn. "Thanks, Mom and Dad. Best surprise ever." For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the screen, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear anything else, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps as the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They had lied to me. They hadn't used the money to save their home, hadn't used it to pull themselves out of some financial disaster, hadn't needed it for anything except to spoil Ryan, to reward him for simply existing while I was expected to struggle, to work, to sacrifice without question. The betrayal burned through me like wildfire, white-hot and unforgiving, my hands shaking as I tossed my phone onto the passenger seat and turned the key in the ignition, my mind racing, my pulse hammering, my vision blurring with the sheer force of my rage. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think. I drove straight to my parents' house, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, my entire body vibrating with fury as I pulled into the driveway, my tires skidding slightly against the pavement. I barely registered slamming the car door shut behind me, barely noticed the way my hands trembled as I stormed inside, my mother turning to me with a pleasant, unsuspecting smile, as if she hadn't just stolen from me, as if she hadn't just played me like a fool. "Jessica," she said casually, as if nothing was wrong, as if my entire world hadn't just tilted sideways, as if she hadn't just proven, once and for all, that I would never be enough for them. I stared at her, my chest heaving, my voice sharp enough to cut through steel when I finally spoke. "Where's the money?" She blinked, feigning confusion, tilting her head slightly in that way she always did when she was pretending not to understand, when she was trying to make me feel like I was the unreasonable one, the dramatic one, the one who was overreacting. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" I felt something inside me snap, something that had been holding me together for years, finally shattering beyond repair. "You said you needed that money to save your house," I spat, my hands clenching into fists at my sides, my entire body vibrating with the sheer force of my rage. "But you bought Ryan a damn car instead." She didn't even look ashamed, didn't even have the decency to pretend that she felt bad, didn't even hesitate before shrugging like it was the most natural thing in the world, like it was something I should have already understood. "He deserves it more," she said simply, her voice calm, her expression blank, as if those 4 words weren't enough to break me in half. I stared at her, my breath catching in my throat, my vision blurring at the edges, my heart pounding so violently that I thought it might explode. And then, just like that, the anger settled. It didn't fade, didn't disappear, didn't lessen in intensity, but it sharpened, turned cold, turned calculating. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. Instead, I grabbed my car keys, turned on my heel, and walked right back out the door. Because if they thought they could steal from me, if they thought they could use me, if they thought they could get away with this, then they had no idea who they were dealing with. The drive to the bank was a blur of red lights, sharp turns, and the overwhelming sound of my own breathing, heavy and uneven, filling the silence of my car like a warning, like a countdown, like something about to snap. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had turned white, my mind running through every possible scenario, every possible excuse they might try to throw at me, every possible way this could get worse than it already was. I had known my parents played favorites, had always understood, deep down, that Ryan would always come first, that I would always be the one expected to sacrifice, to bend, to break if it meant making their lives easier. But this? This wasn't just favoritism. This wasn't just neglect. This was theft. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, my pulse was hammering so violently that I could feel it in my throat, my breath coming in shallow bursts as I forced myself to steady my shaking hands, as I forced myself to think logically, as I forced myself to push the anger down long enough to get the answers I needed. Because this wasn't just about $50,000 anymore. This wasn't just about Ryan's brand new car, or my mother's casual cruelty, or my father's silence that had always said more than words ever could. This was about something bigger, something that felt wrong in a way I couldn't yet explain, something that made my stomach twist with unease as I stepped into the bank and approached the counter, my voice surprisingly steady when I asked to speak with the manager. The woman behind the desk, a neatly dressed woman in her early 50s with kind eyes and a practiced smile, glanced up at me, her gaze flicking to the tension in my shoulders, to the way my fingers tapped impatiently against the counter, to the barely contained fury simmering beneath my skin. "Of course," she said, her voice smooth and professional, motioning toward a private office near the back. "Right this way, Miss Carter." I followed her down the short hallway, my heart pounding with every step, my hands curling into fists at my sides as I prepared myself for whatever I was about to find out. She gestured toward a chair across from her desk, and I sat down stiffly, my spine straight, my breath measured, my fingers tightening around the armrests as she typed something into her computer, her brows furrowing slightly before she turned the screen toward me. "Can you confirm these accounts?" she asked, her voice careful, measured, as if she already knew the answer, as if she was waiting for my reaction, as if she had seen this kind of situation before. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the list in front of me, my stomach lurching violently at the sheer number of loans under my name, the sheer amount of debt that had been accrued, the sheer audacity of it all. Mortgage loans. Personal loans. Credit cards I had never applied for. Lines of credit that had been maxed out and left unpaid, fees stacking on top of fees, interest piling up like a snowball rolling straight toward financial ruin. All of it under my name. All of it without my knowledge. I felt something inside me twist, something dark and bitter and sharp, something that made my vision blur at the edges as I stared at the numbers, as I tried to make sense of how long this had been going on, as I tried to understand how they had managed to pull this off without me noticing. And then, the final blow. The mortgage. The one they had sworn was in danger, the one they had cried over, the one they had used to manipulate me into handing over $50,000 without question. It wasn't behind. Not even close. In fact, it had been paid ahead, months ahead, while thousands of dollars had been funneled into gambling sites, casino withdrawals, and expensive purchases under Ryan's name, all of it carefully hidden behind layers of financial deception. All of it masked beneath their lies, all of it orchestrated by people who had never once seen me as their daughter, only as their safety net. My stomach twisted violently, nausea rising in my throat as I forced myself to breathe, forced myself to push past the wave of betrayal, forced myself to focus on what needed to happen next. Because this wasn't just about cutting them off anymore. This was about taking back everything they had stolen from me. I turned back to the bank manager, my voice dangerously calm, my hands no longer shaking, my body steady with the kind of focus that only came when every last ounce of emotion had burned away, leaving nothing but pure, cold intent. What do I need to do to revoke their access? She hesitated for only a moment, her expression unreadable, before she nodded slowly, reaching for a stack of paperwork from the drawer beside her desk. "You'll need to sign these," she said, sliding the documents toward me, her gaze flicking to the rage still burning in my eyes. "And I would strongly recommend filing a fraud report. This isn't just bad financial management, Ms. Carter. This is criminal. Criminal." The word lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating, wrapping around me like a second skin, making my pulse quicken, making my breath hitch, making me realize, for the first time, that this wasn't just about getting my money back. This was about making sure they never did this to anyone else. I grabbed the pen without hesitation, my signature scrawling across the pages, each stroke of ink sealing their fate, each initial a promise that I wasn't walking away from this quietly. And then, just as I was about to leave, just as I was standing to gather my things, just as I was preparing myself for the war that was about to unfold, the bank manager hesitated. Her fingers hovering over the keyboard as something flickered across her face, hesitation, uncertainty, something close to concern. "There's one more thing," she said slowly, her eyes scanning the screen, her voice tinged with something that made my stomach drop. "There's a transaction here from before you were born." I froze, my breath catching in my throat, my heart slamming against my ribs as I turned back toward her, my mind racing, my vision blurring, my hands gripping the edge of the desk as if that would somehow keep me upright. "Before I was born. What kind of transaction?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, my entire body tensed, my entire world tilting slightly as she clicked the file, as she scanned the details, as she looked up at me with something unreadable in her eyes. "Alone," she said, her voice quieter now, more cautious, as if she already knew what she was about to say was going to change everything. "Taken out in your name, almost a full year before your birth date." My entire body went cold, my breath catching in my throat, my hands gripping the desk so tightly that my knuckles ached, my mind racing, my stomach twisting, my entire world shifting into something I no longer recognized. Because if there was a loan under my name before I was even born, then that meant my parents had been lying about more than just money. The words echoed in my mind long after I had left the bank, repeating over and over like a song stuck on a loop, twisting into something darker, something heavier, something that made my stomach churn with unease. A loan taken out in my name nearly a full year before I was born. The impossibility of it lingered like a weight on my chest, tightening with every breath, every passing second, every quiet realization that whispered through my thoughts, reminding me that this wasn't just an oversight, wasn't just a clerical error. wasn't just another instance of my parents using me for their own benefit. This was something else entirely, something deeper, something that felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite put into words yet. I drove home in silence, my fingers clenching the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, my breath coming in short, controlled bursts as I tried to force my mind into logic, into reason, into some kind of explanation that would make sense of what I had just learned. But there was no explanation, no rational reason for why my name, my legal identity, had been used before I had even existed. The moment I stepped into my apartment, I grabbed my laptop and started searching, my fingers flying across the keyboard, my pulse hammering in my ears as I dug through public records, financial databases, anything that might give me even the smallest clue. But every search led to dead ends, every inquiry brought more questions than answers, every document I found only made me feel like I was slipping further down a rabbit hole I was never meant to find. So I did what I should have done years ago. I hired a financial investigator. His name was Michael Tate, a former forensic accountant with a reputation for uncovering hidden fraud, a man who had spent the better part of his career tracking down money that had been siphoned away into places no one was supposed to find. When I explained the situation over the phone, he didn't sound surprised, didn't question how something like this could have happened, didn't act like I was crazy for believing my own parents had done something terrible. Instead, he simply said, "If there's something to find, I'll find it." It took him less than 48 hours. The email arrived late at night, a single attachment sitting at the bottom of the message, taunting me, daring me to open it, daring me to finally see the truth I had unknowingly been running from my entire life. I clicked the file with trembling fingers, my breath catching as I scanned the document, my heart pounding so violently that I thought it might burst straight through my ribs. A birth certificate. With my name. But not my birth date. The date listed was nearly a year before the one on my official records, a discrepancy that made my vision blur, my head spin, my stomach lurch with the kind of realization that could knock the air straight from your lungs. There was no way this was a mistake, no way this was just an administrative error, no way this was anything but intentional. Because if this birth certificate was real, if I had, at some point, legally existed before I was supposed to, then who the hell was I? And why had my parents gone to such great lengths to erase it? I didn't sleep that night, couldn't stop the way my hands trembled as I stared at the screen, rereading the document over and over again, as if the words might change, as if the truth might shift, as if I might wake up and find that this had all been some kind of twisted dream. But it wasn't. This was real. This was happening. And there was only one person who might know the truth. Ryan. The next morning, I drove straight to my brother's apartment, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that I could feel my nails digging into my palm, my entire body vibrating with the kind of tension that only comes when you know you're about to hear something you can never unhear. He opened the door hesitantly, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place, guilt, maybe, or fear, or the quiet kind of understanding that came from knowing exactly why I was there. I didn't waste time. I held up my phone, the birth certificate glowing on the screen, my voice sharp, cutting, laced with an edge of something dangerously close to desperation. "Tell me the truth, Ryan. Did you know?" His face paled instantly, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the doorframe like he needed to physically ground himself, like he was bracing for something he had spent years trying to avoid. For a long moment, he didn't answer, didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared at me like I was a ghost standing in his doorway, like I had already figured out the thing they had spent so long keeping from me. And then, finally, barely above a whisper, he said the words that made my blood run cold. "I don't think you were ever supposed to know." I took a step back, my breath hitching, my hands shaking, my entire body locking up as if my bones had turned to stone, as if my heart had momentarily forgotten how to beat. Because that wasn't just an admission. That was a warning. And suddenly, I knew. I had to confront them. I had to go straight to my parents, had to demand answers, had to push past every lie, every excuse, every carefully constructed facade they had built, had to force them to look me in the eyes and tell me why they had been living in a house made of deception. Why they had rewritten my existence like it was a simple equation they could change whenever it suited them. By the time I pulled into their driveway, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the front porch, making everything feel just a little more sinister, just a little more like a warning, just a little more like a moment I wouldn't be able to come back from. They were waiting for me, sitting in the living room like they had already known I was coming, like they had already rehearsed the conversation, like they had already decided exactly how this was going to go. I stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind me, the silence stretching, the tension rising, the air so thick with unspoken words that I thought I might choke on them. "You should have left this alone," my father muttered finally, his voice calm, cold, detached, like he was already mourning the fact that his carefully constructed world was about to crumble. I stared at him, my chest tightening, my breath catching, my entire world tilting as realization finally settled into my bones. This wasn't just about money. This was about something far, far worse. The moment I stepped back into my apartment, I felt the weight of exhaustion settle into my bones, but there was no room for rest, no time for hesitation, no space for the emotions that threatened to claw their way to the surface. My fingers trembled slightly as I tossed my bag onto the kitchen counter, my breath still uneven from the confrontation at my parents' house, my mind still reeling from the words my father had let slip before I walked out the door. "You should have left this alone." The way he had said it, the cold certainty in his voice, the way his jaw had tensed as if he knew he had already lost control of the narrative, sent a slow, creeping chill down my spine. I knew there was more. I knew I hadn't even scratched the surface. And now I had no choice but to keep going. I grabbed my laptop from the table, flipping it open with a sharp exhale, my fingers moving instinctively over the keyboard, pulling up the documents I had taken from the bank, scanning every line, every number, every date, searching for something, anything that would explain why a loan had been taken out in my name before I had even been born. My heart pounded harder with every file I opened, every inconsistency I spotted, every detail that didn't make sense. And then, buried beneath layers of financial transactions, hidden among mundane utility bills and mortgage statements, I found it. A name. A birth certificate. One that didn't belong to Ryan. One that didn't belong to me. One that belonged to someone I had never even heard of. The paper was old, the scanned copy slightly faded, but the information was clear as day, and the moment my eyes landed on my mother's name listed under mother/parent, my breath caught in my throat. There had been another child. A daughter, born nearly 5 years before me. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring slightly, my pulse hammering in my ears as I tried to process what I was looking at, as I tried to understand why I had never known about this, why no one had ever said a word, why I had gone my entire life believing that I was the firstborn when that had never been the truth. The birth date on the document was chillingly close to another date I had seen earlier, one that now rang in my head like an alarm. The loan. The one taken out under my name before I had even existed. The dates weren't just close, they were identical. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my fingers tightening into fists as a sinking feeling settled deep in my stomach, a nauseating realization beginning to take shape. The loan had never been for me. It had been for her. For the sister I had never met. For the sister who had simply disappeared. My breath came faster, shallow and sharp, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the one person I knew wouldn't shut me out, the one person who had cracked, even just a little, under the pressure of my questions before. Ryan. It took 4 rings before he picked up, his voice groggy, irritated, like I had just woken him from a dream that he didn't want to leave. "What do you want, Jess?" He muttered, and I could already picture him rubbing his eyes, already see him slumped against his expensive leather headboard, still wrapped in the luxury of everything our parents had given him. "I need you to tell me the truth," I said, skipping past any pleasantries, my voice sharper than I intended, my nails digging into the edge of the counter as I braced myself for whatever was about to come next. A heavy silence settled between us, the kind that stretched too long, the kind that made my stomach twist, the kind that told me he already knew exactly what I was about to ask. And then, Finally, a quiet sigh. "I don't think you were ever supposed to know," he murmured, his voice lower now, less defensive, laced with something that almost sounded like guilt. My grip on the phone tightened, my heart hammering so violently that I could barely think straight, my entire body tensing as I forced the next question past my lips. "Who is she, Ryan? What happened to her?" A long pause. And then, just before he hung up, "Ask Dad." The line went dead. My hands trembled as I set the phone down, my breath coming in uneven gasps, my mind spinning with every possibility, every dark theory, every question I had never thought to ask. But now there was no turning back. I grabbed my keys. And for the second time that week, I drove to my parents' house, but this time, I wasn't coming for explanations. I was coming for the truth. The front door was unlocked when I arrived, swinging open easily beneath the weight of my palm, the quiet creak of the hinges filling the empty space like a warning, like a whisper, like something I wasn't supposed to hear. My father was sitting in the living room, his fingers wrapped tightly around a half-empty glass of whiskey, his gaze fixed on the TV even though it wasn't turned on. My mother wasn't in sight. He didn't flinch when I stepped inside, didn't acknowledge my presence, didn't even look surprised, as if he had been expecting me, as if he had known all along that this moment was inevitable. I didn't wait for an invitation to speak. Who was she? The words felt heavier than I expected, sharper, colder, filled with something dangerously close to fury, dangerously close to grief, dangerously close to the kind of realization that couldn't be undone. He exhaled slowly, tipping his glass back, swallowing hard before finally looking at me, his expression unreadable, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw tense. "You don't want to know," he said, his voice low, tired, almost resigned. I took a step closer, my hands curling into fists at my sides, my pulse pounding so hard I thought it might split me open. "You don't get to decide that," I snapped, my voice barely above a whisper, barely controlled, barely masking the rage burning in my chest. "Tell me the truth." For a moment, I thought he wouldn't. For a moment, I thought he would lie, just like he always had, just like they always had, just like they had done my entire life. But then, his shoulders slumped, his fingers loosening around his glass, his gaze flickering toward the fireplace, toward the mantel where all our family photos sat, perfectly arranged, perfectly framed, perfectly incomplete. "You were never supposed to exist," he murmured finally, his voice hollow, his words cutting deeper than anything I had ever heard before. My stomach twisted, my breath catching, my vision swimming as his words settled in, as the weight of them pressed against my chest, as everything I thought I knew collapsed beneath the force of a truth I had never been meant to uncover. And then, just as I thought it couldn't get worse, just as I thought I had reached the bottom of whatever this was, he reached into the drawer of the coffee table, pulling out a single, worn photograph, its edges burnt, the ink smudged. The image faded, but still clear enough to make my blood run cold. A little girl. Dark hair. A smile that looked too much like mine. I turned the photo over, my fingers trembling as I read the name written on the back in delicate, careful handwriting. A name I had never heard before. A name that didn't belong to me. The weight of the photograph lingered in my hands, its edges burned and smudged, its existence undeniable proof that my parents had been lying to me for my entire life. That everything I thought I knew about my own place in this family had been built on a foundation of deception. My father's words still echoed in my mind, twisting through my thoughts like a poison I couldn't purge, making my stomach churn with something far worse than anger, something close to grief, something close to loss, something close to the horrifying realization that I had never truly belonged here at all. "You were never supposed to exist." I had spent years bending over backward for them, trying to earn their approval, trying to make them see me, trying to carve out a space for myself in a family that had only ever wanted me to serve as a replacement, a backup plan, a second attempt at something they had already lost. And now, as I stared at the faded image of a little girl with dark hair and a smile too much like my own, I knew there was no going back, no pretending I didn't know the truth, no allowing them to continue living their lives without consequences. I left without another word, walking out of my parents' house for what I knew in my gut would be the last time, the final conversation between us already written in the decisions I had made, the steps I was about to take, the storm I was about to bring down on them. They had stolen from me, manipulated me, lied to me, erased someone from existence, and tried to bury the truth beneath decades of fabricated stories and false affection, but they had underestimated one thing. I wasn't just going to walk away. I was going to destroy them. The attorney's office was cold, sterile, the scent of old paper and polished would thicken the air as I sat across from a man with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. A legal shark whose reputation for dismantling people like my parents had made him the perfect ally in what was about to unfold. I laid out every document, every financial statement, every fraudulent account, every forged signature, my voice steady despite the fury burning beneath my skin, despite the way my heart hammered against my ribs, despite the way my hands clenched into fists beneath the table as I watched him scan the evidence with a look of quiet satisfaction. "This is more than just financial fraud," he said finally, tapping one of the documents with a measured precision that told me he had already seen the full picture before I had even finished explaining. "This is a systematic pattern of deception, one that spans decades, one that includes identity theft, one that can and will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. You want to freeze their assets, Ms. Carter? Consider it done." It wasn't until I stepped out of the office, the weight of finality settling over me like a second skin, that I realized how deeply the relief ran, how much lighter I felt knowing that for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one cleaning up their mess. I was the one burning it down. But there was still one loose end. Ryan. Finding him wasn't hard. He was predictable in the way that only spoiled, entitled men could be, his routines carved into place by years of knowing that no matter what happened, someone would always bail him out. He was exactly where I expected him to be, leaning against the hood of his brand new car, scrolling through his phone like he had nothing to worry about, like he hadn't unknowingly been part of a scheme that had gone so much deeper than just money. He looked up as I approached, something unreadable flashing across his face, something close to hesitation, something close to guilt, but not quite. "Jess, look, you need to listen." I cut him off, my voice sharper than I intended, my patience already too thin for excuses, too frayed for half-hearted apologies, too raw for anything except the truth. "They've been using you, Ryan. Just like they used me. Just like they've done to everyone in their lives. And if you don't step away now, if you don't cut them off before it's too late, you're going to go down with them." His jaw tightened, his fingers twitching slightly where they rested against the car, his eyes darkening as the weight of my words settled over him, as the reality of what was happening started to sink in. "What do you mean, go down with them?" I exhaled slowly, shaking my head, my heart heavy despite the cold satisfaction that came with knowing my parents were about to lose everything. "They're done, Ryan. Their bank accounts are frozen. Their fraud is being investigated. They're going to lose the house. They're going to lose control of everything. And when that happens, they're going to try to take you down with them, because that's what people like them do." He didn't argue. He didn't deny it. And for the first time in his life, I saw it, the realization that he was nothing more than a pawn in their game, that he had never been the golden child, that he had only ever been another tool they could use to manipulate the world around them. By the time I walked away, I didn't know if he would make the right choice, didn't know if he would finally see them for what they really were, but that wasn't my problem anymore. I had done what I came to do. And now, there was only one thing left. The last conversation. I didn't go to see them out of sentimentality, didn't go to gloat, didn't go for closure, because people like my parents didn't deserve closure, didn't deserve understanding, didn't deserve anything except the consequences of their own choices. I went because I wanted to see the moment they realized they had lost, the moment the power shifted, the moment they understood, finally, that I wasn't someone they could control anymore. And that moment? It was everything. The panic in my mother's eyes as she clutched at the eviction notice in her hands, the rage in my father's voice as he demanded to know what I had done, the helplessness in the way they looked at each other as if waiting for someone to swoop in and save them. But there was no one left. And then, Just as I turned to leave, just as I stepped onto the front porch, my phone buzzed in my pocket, the notification lighting up my screen with a single unread message from an unknown number. A private investigator's name. A sealed letter waiting for me at their office. One my parents had been keeping from me. One that, somehow, I already knew would change everything. The envelope was heavier than I expected, its paper slightly yellowed with age, the corners creased as if it had been handled too many times before finally making its way to me. My fingers trembled as I slid my nail beneath the flap, carefully peeling it open, my breath coming in slow, measured gasps as I prepared myself for whatever truth had been hidden inside for all these years. The private investigator sat across from me, his hands folded neatly on the desk, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that told me he already knew exactly what I was about to read. Something that told me this wasn't just another piece of paperwork, something that told me that once I saw what was inside, there would be no going back. I pulled the letter free, unfolded it slowly, my eyes scanning the first few lines, my pulse hammering in my ears, my stomach twisting with something dark and heavy, something that felt too much like grief. Jessica, if you're reading this, then you've already started asking the questions they never wanted you to ask. And if you've come this far, you deserve the truth, no matter how much it might hurt you. The handwriting was neat, precise, familiar in a way I couldn't quite place, but the weight of the words settled over me like a crushing tide, pressing against my ribs, making it hard to breathe. Your name was never supposed to be Jessica Carter. Your life was never supposed to be yours. And your parents? They were never meant to raise you. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my fingers tightening around the edges of the paper as I forced myself to keep reading, even as my mind screamed at me to stop, even as my heart pounded violently against my ribs, even as everything I thought I knew started to crumble beneath the weight of something far more sinister than I had ever imagined. There was another before you. A daughter, their firstborn. Her name was Abigail. The name hit me like a physical blow, my breath catching in my throat, my vision blurring slightly as I stared down at the letters, trying to make sense of it, trying to fit this missing puzzle piece into a picture that had never made sense to begin with. I could feel the walls of my mind shifting, rearranging, forcing me to reconsider every conversation, every memory, every moment where something had felt just slightly off. But she didn't disappear, Jessica. She didn't run away. She didn't leave. Abigail died. And they never wanted you to know why. My stomach lurched, my fingers gripping the paper so tightly that the edges crumpled beneath my touch, my pulse thundering in my ears so loudly that I could barely hear myself think. You were never supposed to exist. You were never supposed to find this. And if you want to know the rest, you'll have to look deeper than they ever wanted you to. The letter ended there, no signature, no explanation, just a final, ominous warning that settled into my bones like ice, a whisper of something bigger, something darker. Something that had been buried long before I had ever been old enough to understand what I was truly up against. I exhaled slowly, setting the letter down, my hands still trembling, my mind racing through every possibility, every unspoken truth, every lie I had been fed for as long as I could remember. I had always known there was something wrong, had always felt the quiet weight of secrets pressing down on me, had always sensed that my place in this family was something that had been forced rather than chosen. But I had never expected this. I stood up, my body moving before my mind could catch up, my steps steady as I walked toward the investigator's desk, my voice colder than I had ever heard it before when I finally spoke. "Sell the house," I said, the words tasting like finality, like a blade slicing through the last tether that connected me to them. "Make sure they never set foot in it again." He nodded once, no questions, no hesitation, just quiet efficiency as he pulled the necessary paperwork from his drawer, sliding it toward me without a word. And just like that, they lost everything. Ryan didn't fight it when I told him what I had done, didn't argue, didn't defend them, didn't even look surprised when I told him about Abigail, about the sister neither of us had ever known, about the child who had come before me and the secrets our parents had been willing to keep at any cost. For the first time in his life, he looked lost, like a boy standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable, like someone who had spent his whole life living in a world that had never been real. "I think I always knew," he murmured finally, his voice hollow, empty, his fingers clenching and unclenching at his sides as he stared at the ground. I just didn't want to believe it. I nodded once, not offering comfort, not offering forgiveness, not offering anything at all, because there was nothing left to say, nothing left to fix, nothing left between us except the wreckage of a life built on lies. I left town that night, my car packed with everything that mattered, which, in the end, turned out to be very little. There was no final goodbye, no dramatic confrontation, no lingering sentimentality for a family that had never truly been mine. But just as I pulled onto the highway, just as the city lights faded in my rearview mirror, just as I let myself believe, for one fleeting second, that this was over, my phone buzzed. A single message. No number. No name. No explanation. "You were never supposed to find out." And just like that, I knew this wasn't over.